how are the personality traits measured in a scientific, rigorous way to begin with? And then how can people get this reliably tested, like me, if they're curious?
Yeah. I'll take the second one first. Big Five measurements can be accessed on the web very easily. So if you just put Big Five personality traits, there are a number of Big Five assessment devices that you can take that are free. There are others that are the gold standard that you need to pay for. My colleagues, Adam Grant and initiated by Ray Dalio, have created an online personality test that is free called Principles U, YOU. And it covers the Big Five, but some additional traits as well. And these have been rigorously developed. They're based on item statistics, which items cohere together in coherent ways, which can be thrown out because they're obscure or because everybody answers them the same way, which is no good for differentiating among individuals or between. And so it's quite easy to get yourself measured on these traits of personality. There is a sixth one I should mention: the honesty, humility trait that Mike Ashton and Kim have engaged and developed over the years. Virtually everybody says that this too is an important dimension of personality. And we've included that in Principles U, or something very similar to that, which gets into the whole business of being intellectually humble. And humility, the willingness to accept that you could be wrong, and to actually enjoy being disconfirmed, is something that many of us are seeing as it's the hallmark of open science. This is a hallmark of, here are my data. Where did I screw up? And there was a not entirely apocryphal tale of a mathematician at Oxford who, after a talk, had a person come up and say, I'd like to point out, if you don't mind, I think you're totally wrong, and here's where you've made your mistake. And the fellow said, oh my God, thank you so much. You saved me years of work. And when you talk to many scientists right now, the first thing you do, if somebody says you made a mistake, is you say, no, I haven't. Couldn't have. I got 4 postdocs working on this with me. But intellectual humility, the capacity to say, ooh, wow. Could I have been wrong? Well, yes. I didn't think so, but let's take a look. But I wasn't. But thank you for making me more aware of that potential issue. Or, we're going to have to start from square one again. And as you know, that in the field of science, I know you're a philosopher, but in the field of science, experiments don't always work, and mistakes are made. And having an attitude of positive openness, another aspect of openness to being wrong, is, I think, fundamental to open science and to actually living a valuable life. People who are absolutely certain they're right on everything can often stumble in their lives.
So returning to the first question that I asked, though, how is it that the traits are scientifically or rigorously measured or determined in a person?
Yep. One of the dominant perspectives on traits is the lexical hypothesis. This goes back to the rootedness in common languages around the world of traits of personality. Why did all languages have a word that could be translated as kind, or as energetic, or as sad, or depressed. And so psychologists early on, Gordon Allport and one of his students, Hodbert, did a study where they accumulated thousands of these aspects of personality in adjectival form and arranged through various statistical techniques to see what underlies these diverse lexical hypotheses, these lexical terms. And it was that kind of work in the lexical tradition carried out by psychologists and others around the world that led gradually to the Big Five and its evidence that it has broad cultural generalizability. It's not perfect. There are some cultures in which those terms that capture, say, the Big Five do not appear. There are blends of them, for example, or completely indigenous characterizations of individual differences. But generally speaking, particularly with an educated sample of individuals, you're going to get the Big Five replicated. And so it can be done by questionnaire items, such as, I like to party. And you get individuals to answer those questions. Or they can be done by adjectives, sociable. And these tend to capture the same things. There are reasons to prefer each of those. I have a slight preference for adjectival forms. But the common element that you do is that you aggregate these items into coherent themes, and you use mathematical techniques, factor analysis and cluster analysis, and other techniques that look at the items that converge together and those that are differentiated from them. And they can be orthogonal. For example, the Big Five are thought to be orthogonal, so that there's a zero correlation between your scores on each of the Big Five. Sometimes you may be looking at facets underlying traits, and they may be not orthogonal, but actually you use a factor analytic technique called oblique factor analysis that looks at some partial dependencies some partial correlations between the subfactors. All of this is highly technical, but there's a great deal of common agreement that when you run these factor analyses of people responding to items, the items that should cluster together theoretically, such as I like to party, I can't be in a city without looking people up, I really love people, all those items should cohere. A person who scores high on one should also score high on the others, and they do. And so that is the rigorous, and it's really rigorous, the kind of research that goes into the establishing of, say, a commercial trait measure like Costin McRae's NEO-PIR, which is the granddaddy, the gold standard of trait measurement. There's a great deal of work, like thousands of hours of research, looking at the psychometrics of these instruments. Did I answer that?
Yes, you totally did. Yeah. So it sounds like it's generally done with self-reported questionnaires.
Also, and hand in hand with this, has been the insistence by trait theorists that we need to show that you're not just delusional, that we need to have peer ratings. And so if George sees himself as very extroverted, but nobody else does, they all rate him as rather more introverted, then you need to take that into account before you ascribe a stable predicate to him that he is extroverted. And so it raises the empirical question, which has been adequately answered, which is there generally a concordance between self-rated Big Five traits and peer-rated ratings of you? And the answer is yes. Very strong concordance. So it rules out, at least at a general level, there may be a few exceptions, and depending on what groups you're looking at. But generally speaking, people are reporting with an awareness of how others see them as well, and that there isn't that much discrepancy. In fact, there's large-scale convergence, and that's kind of check upon one of the frequent criticisms, which is a rather weak criticism, is that people are just going to lie. There are some cases where you're taking a test for an employment situation, where the question may be, I really like to cause a lot of trouble just for fun, where you may rate yourself much lower on that than you normally would, because you're applying for a job, for God's sakes, and so on. There are ways of handling that as well. There are ways of looking at whether people are overly presenting a positive self. And you can put in a correction factor for that. If they're doing it on all the possible options, then you're going to diminish the estimate of their score on these positive traits. So there are a whole bunch of corrective factors that go into the background on these tests. Generally, there's another rule that has emerged over the last 40 years in personality assessment, and that is sometimes, excuse me, a straight, direct magnitude rating on a well-defined trait can do just as well as these more intensely constructed inventories. A lot of this work came out of the Oregon Research Institute in Eugene, Oregon. And basically, the argument is if you could describe what an extroverted person is on one end, and in a couple of phrases, and what a more introverted person is, and then you get a direct magnitude estimate by having a line and having the person bisect where they are on that line, measure it. Excuse me. You can get a high level of agreement with the more laboriously created personality scales. Now, this isn't nice news to those who earn their living by creating these long scales. But to someone like me who puts a great deal of credence in self-report and who believes that individuals have a fair degree of insight into what they're really like, excuse me, these results are quite encouraging.